So the drill press is by far not the most widely used tool in my shop, but it's one of those tools that serves a very useful purpose when drilling holes. Anyone who's done dowel work, joinery work, a variety of applications on a drill press freehand knows how valuable these tools are. So the catalyst for this video is that a couple weeks ago I clamped this throwaway piece of plywood to the top of the table, and it has just made applications that I used the table saw for substantially easier, just having that larger flat surface on there. So it's the middle of summer, and that is traditionally my slowest time of year by far. I'm going to utilize some of that free time I have to make a table for my drill press. I also think I'm going to make some kind of rolling storage. I've seen people make similar things to what I'm going to make. I'm going to modify it for my own purposes that will fit underneath of here. And then potentially one or two things for the top, but I'll have to see how my time goes with that. The main design for this is coming out of this. It's actually a compilation of a bunch of articles from Wood Magazine, and it's this one right here. And I'm not necessarily going to follow their instructions because I want to make this more catered towards what I would use it for. And I've been using a drill press long enough to know what the bulk of my applications are on that. So this is just kind of like a rough guide I'm going to be using to make it. I believe if you want to make this one, you could find this article online. I'm not 100% sure on that though. As far as jigs go, this one is really simple and basic. You pretty much have a laminated top for structure and then a throwaway piece on top, as well as an insert for different applications on the saw. The bottom of it will have a T-track, which is how you will clamp it to the table that came with your drill press, and then it has a fence system that also rides in a surface mounted T-track to move the fence forward and backwards. The bottom T-track will also make it so the table could slide back and forth, because what I think I'm going to do for this one is I've had a lot of large vertical pieces I've been drilling recently, and they don't fit on the drill press even with the table lowered all the way to the bottom. So I think on the edge I'm going to make a vertical mount for larger pieces. The dimensions for the top, the one that I made ended up being about 30 inches by almost 15 inches. And the dimensions are somewhat parts I took from the book, but also I used all pieces of scrap for this build, scrap MDF and scrap cabinet grade plywood. So a lot of my dimensions were dictated by the pieces I had. So like I said earlier, the drill press table is a fairly simple jig. It's basically just a laminated table with some slots for T-track, and you can really get as creative or as uncreative with it as you want. But at the end of the day, they're all kind of from the same mold and design. So this is just roughing out those initial pieces, and I cut all these pieces oversized because when you laminate these together, they're going to shift and move a little bit, and you're going to want to even out them on the table saw before they're final done. So the base of it is 2 sheets of 1/2 inch plywood, which I cut down, and now this is cutting down the 1/4 inch. They recommended hardboard, but I have MDF in 1/4 inch, so that is what I used. And the top MDF is 4 separate sections. The 2 edges are the same sizes, and then actually the middle has 3 pieces, and that is so that you can have a removable insert on that middle piece. So I laid out those 2 edges and then cut those 3 middle sections. I ended up not having enough MDF to make that middle removable insert, so for most of this I use a piece of 1/8 inch hardwood. And then these are my final pieces ready for glue up. I wrote measurements on all of them. Now that middle piece, I'm leaving a rather large groove on the side, and that is how I'm going to attach the vertical fence on the side of this table, by leaving a large groove that will allow for a tenon, and the tenon will be attached to the vertical table. So before I finish that and glue this all together, I filed out a little thumb hole so that you can remove that insert in the middle there easily. So with that thumb hole in place, I just have a rough spacer insert because, like I said, I don't have the right size piece. And then it was time for glue up, so I used a series of cauls in order to sandwich this together. You want the laminated piece to be really flat, so you wanted to add a lot of clamping pressure on all of these pieces to keep them flat. I'm also putting 2 1/2-inch spacers where I'm going to eventually put that tenon on the edge, so that when I glue this together I don't warp that edge piece, and that 1/2-inch piece fits in easy. And then on the top I use some blue tape just to keep all those pieces aligned before I put my top edge caul on, and then clamp this all together with a series of C-clamps. Then in the end, and I don't think it's in the video until the next day when I remove the weight, I put some really heavy cinder blocks on the top of this as well. So then this is the next day and I'm taking all those clamps off, and on big glue ups like this I do usually wait overnight before I take the clamps and the weight off. I sometimes want to rush these things, but I have had jobs, tabletops, start to delaminate when I've taken them out of the clamps too soon. So when there's a lot of surface area, especially this broad flat surfaces that aren't exposed to air, they're just going to dry a lot slower. So I do let most of these pieces dry overnight. Then I could take my shims out and start working on the top again. So this lamination glued up fairly nicely. I just removed all the glue drips off of one edge, so I had one fairly straight edge, and then I referenced that edge off of my table saw fence and ripped that other edge clean, and then I could flip it and rip that initial edge clean as well. I'm not removing much in these passes because it's already close to final dimensions, maybe like about 1/8 of an inch. Then once I had those two flat sides, I used my cross-cut sled to rip my 2 edges clean as well. And same thing, I'm not removing a ton of material, maybe about 1/8 of an inch. So the next step is this table is going to be movable in various different positions on the top of the fence that's already on the drill press. So I'm just cutting out a semicircle on the back section that's wide enough to fit around the column on my saw, so that this table can be adjustable forward and backward and be able to clear that column. This is a pretty small circle. I guess you could make this as big as you want, but I just made mine at a similar dimension to what was in those directions. And then I just kind of roughly sanded this. I'm going to sand it again later, but I wanted to get all those glue drops off of there so that when I'm doing more work on it, even a slight bulge in that glue can cause my cuts to be off. So this next step I hadn't initially planned on doing when I set out to do this, but after I was looking at that laminated piece for the table saw top, I knew that I would ding it up, especially the edges, really quickly if they weren't faced with anything. So ideally I would have faced this with maple or oak, but I didn't have that laying around, but I do have a lot of scrap pieces of poplar, so that was a good second choice. So my method for joining face frames on cabinets, and this is a similar philosophy, is to add a spline around the entire edge of the piece. Obviously I won't have to do the side that's getting the tenon, and that spline is going to be the same thickness as the hardboard I have in my shop, which is a little over 1/8 inch. So I had to do 2 passes on the table saw with my tall fence, and once you get that groove around the whole edge, you could put that spline in there and then put a receiving groove in your poplar and attach the whole thing, and it makes for a really strong structural edge. So the poplar I'm using are cut-offs from making cabinet doors, so they were actually almost the exact same thickness I needed, so I didn't cut them down before I started. I just referenced where that groove is on my tabletop and transferred those measurements to my table saw fence and cut a groove in all of those poplar pieces. Once I had both those grooves, I could take the measurement of both of their depths and add it together, which ended up being about a little over 1 inch for me. And then I cut about 1.25 inch slabs off of this piece of hardboard, and that will be the filler for my splines. So I usually glue this all together at once, but the groove in my plywood was a really snug fit, and I was nervous that if I put that spline in there to test fit it, it wouldn't come back out. So I just cut my losses and then glued those splines into all of my edges first before I glued the poplar on as well. And then once I got it in there, I just test to make sure that it's deep enough, and use that poplar to hammer it in a little bit more if I have to. You just want to be careful if you're gluing these in at 2 separate times that you remove all that excess glue, because then the poplar won't fit on top of it nicely if there's any glue buildup. And for these splines, in order to cut them, I just use a pair of aviator snips. They're really easy to cut, and I just went around the entire perimeter except for that tenon side and added those wooden splines. So I decided to miter all the corners on this, and it's a much slower process than butt jointing things and a little bit harder to get accurate, but it looks so much nicer than butt jointed corners. So the way I go about doing this is I don't have a great spot for cutting miters. My table saw does a good job, but I don't have, my chop saw isn't accurately set up, so I cut all of these by hand with a hand saw, and they ended up turning out fine. So I just mark those edges with the pieces in place. I mark those edges using a quick square for the 45s, and then once again that one edge that's the tenon doesn't have a piece, so it's only going to go around 3 sides, and I would just cut all those miters and then move to the next piece with the previous pieces set in place, and that usually gives me very accurate measurements. So like I said, I just have a miter box and an old saw, and I'm just cutting those corners. I think it ended up only being 3 corners, so it wasn't a terrible thing to do by hand. And then as I go, I just make marks and measurements and cut all of those pieces, and it ended up fitting quite nicely in the end. Then once my dry fit was good, I glued this all together. So you're just adding glue to the inside of those poplar spline grooves and the holes. And then this went together really smoothly, so I only put a couple brads in all of the pieces, and then I don't think this is in the video, but I did add a few, yeah, there it is, I add a few clamps as well. So I took that table out of the clamps first thing this morning, and I set it up on my drill press, and that's basically what it's going to look like on there. I'm waiting for the T-track to get shipped, and since it's the holiday, today is actually the 4th of July. It probably won't come until tomorrow, but you'll basically attach it under the table with some T-track, and you'll be able to move this around. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start on the vertical table, and that basically will mean I can swivel the table that's connected to the table saw over, and adjust the table, as well as swing the head by loosening these 2 set screws, and then that puts the drill basically over the edge of my table. So it will take some adjustments, but you would have to swing both of those to do vertical work anyway, and then I'll have a nice platform here to clamp pieces to and be able to drill them vertically, and then kind of the sky's the limit with length there. Now the nice thing about this is while it will take some maneuvering to get this set up, I really only do large end boring pieces a couple times a year, so it's worth making the jig so I have it, but like I said, it will take some moving around to get everything set up in order to use it. Now if you just want a vertical jig, in that same book they have a very simple platform that clamps to the table, and then a vertical piece here. Once again, you will still have to move the head and probably the table a little bit in order to line that all up. But this is a very simple jig if you want something that's not as time consuming to make and potentially maneuver around. But since I already have this made, I decided to kind of make it a 2-in-1 over here. In order to make that flat panel, I'm going to be laminating some pieces, probably some MDF. I'm also going to be laminating pieces for both fences, and the fence design in the book uses maple. I don't have a ton of scrap maple, so I'm not going to use it. So I'm basically going to kind of rely on, this is the Norm Abrams router table, and he used MDF for his fences. I made this years ago. This is one of the first things I made when I started this business, and it's still square and true to this day. So that's kind of what I'm going to use with the 45s in the back to keep everything true. So the process for making all the laminations for the components of these tables is identical to the laminations for the tabletop, and once again it is somewhat dictated by the scrap I had. I didn't have enough scrap 1/2-inch ply for all the components, but I did have some scrap 1/2-inch MDF, which is going to be a little heavy for the vertical fence, but it ended up working out. So I just rough cut 2 pieces for the vertical fence, and the vertical fence is about 24 inches long by 12 inches high. So I rough cut that. And then for the top of these pieces, I don't have any more of that 1/4 inch MDF, but I do have pieces of about 1/8 inch hardboard with that shiny coating on the one side, which will make sliding pieces on this rather nice. So I use that shiny coating as my top lamination for the vertical fence, as well as all of my fences on the top of the board. And then I glued all these together the same way I did the last one. This was a little bit easier because I don't have that space for the tenon. And since this MDF was really flat, I basically just glued it together, and then I used weights on top of it, those cinder blocks again, to hold everything together. I ended up throwing, I think, 2 clamps on there as well. So then once I had all that in place, it came time to do the same process but for all my fence pieces. And this I had 1/2 inch plywood for the fence pieces. And the easiest way to do this was to glue it together in one big section and then cut all of my other pieces out of that one big section. So I rough cut that plywood to, I believe it was a little over 30 inches by a little over 12 inches wide. So it's 2 pieces of 1/2 inch plywood, and then once again a piece of that hardboard with the white coating on top. And then with this piece, since the plywood isn't as true as the MDF, it warps a little bit over time. MDF stays relatively flat. I use the same process of using the cawls and sandwiching this together with clamps. And then once again I let all these pieces set up overnight. So the next day I went through and put pieces of tape on all of the pieces, demarcating what parts I'm cutting out. Just because there was a lot of pieces, it's easier to have a visual reference to remind you of what you're cutting. So the first thing I did was I took that sideboard for the vertical fence, and I did the exact same thing I did with the tabletop fence. I ripped that one side clean, flipped it over, and ripped the other side clean till it was about the right measurements, and then cleaned up the edges on the radial arm saw. Then for the piece that's going to be all my fences, I did the exact same thing, cleaned up the edges so I had a nice reference point, and then I could start ripping all my pieces. So the fence for the table saw, the fence for the drill press is going to be 3 inches tall and 3 inches wide, and then the fences for the vertical are about 11 inches wide by 2 inches tall. Then once I had all of those pieces cut out, I brought everything to the radial arm saw and cleaned up my edges. At this point, the fence for the vertical section was still in one piece, so I cut that down into 2 pieces as well. So on both of my movable fences, I'm going to be running with this shiny side down so that I could glue 45s onto these. These 45s will keep these fences true over time because they'll keep everything from being able to move. So in order to get the 45 on the smaller fence, I just took a piece of maple and marked out where the top of the fence was and the edge of the fence and drew a triangle. I cut them roughly out on my bandsaw and then sanded them smooth. And for that smaller fence, I'm only going to have 2 of them. For the bigger fence, I did the exact same thing. I put that maple in place, made my 2 marks for where it met the front and the back of the fence, and then I cut this out in 2 sections. If you square off that edge, you could get 2 triangles from one piece. So I'm going to be using those 45s to attach the 2 pieces, but I'm also going to be using some screws at the base of the fences for extra strength. So I drilled some holes in the 2 fences. I only show drilling them in the small one, but I did all of them. So the small one has 3 holes, the big one will have 5, and then I countersunk those holes so that none of the hardware I put in there sticks out. So then for the 2 fences that are going on, the 2 fence pieces that are going on the drill press table, I cut out arcs on them so that none of the column and the head of the drill doesn't hit the fence. So on the vertical piece, it was a very shallow arc, and then on the flat bottom, I just copied the arc that was already on the table. So here's that shallow arc on the top, and then I just copied that semicircle, but didn't make it as big, otherwise it would cut through the entire fence on that bottom part. So before I start putting this all together, I put a shallow groove on the front edge of that fence, and this will just help with dust buildup on the drill press and obstructing putting pieces there. The dust will get caught in that groove and won't sit on the edge of your two faces. So then it came time to put the dado in the front edge of the fence. You could do this after you make it. I just found it was easiest to do it before I put it all together. So I just cut that groove that will fit my T-track. And then it came time to glue all these pieces together. So this is pretty simple because I already have those 45s. So it's just a matter of putting glue on your edges. And this whole process, you're double checking, triple checking that your fence is square. So I glued it up on the table it's going to be sitting on, and as I added those 45s, I put 2 brads into them just to hold them in place. Once this glue dries, these will be extremely strong. And then after I did that, I was making sure that this was square. It was meeting at a 90-degree angle, and then putting those brads in. And then once the brads were in, I was able to screw the screws in, and I think I didn't have ideal screws. I had drywall screws, which I might swap out later, but putting those in the front, and then I let this whole thing dry. So I was hoping to fit this drill press table jig into one video, but that's just not going to happen. The whole thing would be over 40 minutes if it was one video, but the jig is pretty much done. There's a little bit of tweaking I want to do, and I might add a couple other things to it. I have to see how that goes, but this is where I'm at when that first part's uploaded. So I've been testing out how that vertical and boring jig works, and since I already have it done, I probably won't wait until next week to upload this part. I might upload it midweek or so, but this is basically what this thing turned out to look like.